computer actually. Okay. So our goal for today is to describe how to approach a data project from a UX perspective, as I mentioned earlier. And there's a lot to talk about around data projects, but we're going to focus in on this in particular. And then we're hoping this will become a series for us, and we'll talk more about all the questions we don't answer with you all today. The data challenge really that everyone is focused on these days is around how data science projects fail. And in 2019, Gartner reported this staggering statistic, right? 85% is a huge number of data project failures. And, even fewer projects, that do succeed have a return on investment or are doing their job to increase efficiency and productivity and protect revenue. So that's the challenge that we're focused on as we go about this conversation today. And Steve, it looked like you had something you wanted to add, or is that okay? No problem. So the reason why people are running into this problem is that data projects are exciting. It's easy to get excited about data and to see what's possible, right? And it's dreaming about the future and what insights are we going to gain. And naturally, those projects can often start from a data first perspective. So there's research and development teams and data teams who are putting together these, creating data availability, I should say. And all of these really interesting projects got funded and took off, but then there was a barrier to adoption when it came time to use the data sometimes, and users were confused or experienced information overwhelm, and so adoption doesn't occur. So sometimes a pilot gets funded and then it falls flat and things don't move forward, especially if you've already invested a lot of time and effort and money and then people aren't using the product. So there's a problem here within the data story, and the solution that we're focused on is thinking about these projects from a human-centered design mindset. So really tackling the user research up front, putting the user at the core of everything that we're talking about around data, and then going through the project from that perspective and testing iteratively with those users to make sure that they can make sense of that data. So a lot of times data projects though might just be about creating that data lake, right? Or creating accessibility to the data, but we're thinking of it from the perspective of let's take it all the way forward to then how do people get access to those data pipelines? What do they do with it? And how does it show up in those UIs? So that before you embark on a large scale data project, you can think about how it's going to get accessed and used. And certainly governance comes to mind, and we'll be talking about that in a future meetup. So why are we so focused on human-centered design besides the fact that we're a UX agency? We think about it this way because it's about finding the right solution to the problem that a user is having at the moment that they need that solution in their journey. So historically, as I said, data projects got stood up by people who are data experts and developers. And, we all know the story of data silos, right? We have all these silos and everybody gets excited about the idea of let's not have silos anymore. Let's bring everything together into one centralized location. That's going to solve all of our problems. But it introduced a new problem. Now you have kind of a bottleneck and all this pressure on the teams who are managing all of this data. And then they have to figure out how to get everybody access and how to ensure integrity. And people were still going out and creating their own versions of the data in, separate tools, applications, or systems so that they could just function in their jobs, right? People still need to get things done. So this wasn't ideal. It was forward progress, but it introduced new problems. And one thing that we see is that the user is still missing from the process largely when you go about it from back end to the front end. And we want to focus today on putting that UX piece at the forefront of projects. So a lot of people may not be familiar with knowledge graphs, but this is a really great example of, how you can take data and pull it together and put it into a UI on the front end here. And a lot of times the user research piece doesn't come in until way over here, right when you're about to design the UI. And we're suggesting that the UX piece needs to come in much earlier and be part of the process throughout the entire life cycle. So right when you're kind of thinking about your data and thinking that we need to connect this data together, that's the right time to start conducting your user research and really understanding the business use cases for that data. And then how is it going to manifest in the UI eventually? And how does all of this unstructured, sometimes data and structured data need to connect to each other. What's the relationship between this data? And then how does that show up in the UI if all of this data has different metadata around it? It's not normalized. It wasn't created at the same time or in the same systems. And user experience can help solve that problem. And again, it needs to happen at the front of the data projects, and then it can inform all of the things that happen from that initial ideation stage all the way through to the product being launched. So this slide kind of shows you how some different pieces of data can connect together. So we always have consumer data, or it might be enterprise data if this is an enterprise application. You might have a domain ontology external to your organization even, or it could be internal to your organization, things like product reviews and analytics and so on. Even experts, right? People who know, they may not be responsible for the domain ontology, but they're experts in the data and they have something to contribute to a system. And you have recommendation engines and billing, and there's so many more things that you could put in here to connect information together. And this is the type of disparate sets of data that we work with all the time to normalize it, put it into a UI, and make sure that it's findable and actionable. And we think about things like how quickly can you get to the information you need and get value from that information. It's one thing to find it, and it's another thing to then be able to take action on it that's meaningful to you. So I like this slide a lot, and you could fill these boxes up with so many different things. These are just some of the things that UX touches, but a lot of people don't realize how much the research we do in user experience touches all of these different areas. And sometimes it gets confusing because somebody in marketing might say, hey, we've already done that research. And it's like, great, let's bring that research in. Let's all talk to each other and share our findings and our understanding of what the user needs are and pains, and how we then use that across the business. So UX really needs to be kind of everywhere, in my opinion, of course. I'm a little biased, but when you're talking about an enterprise organization or a product that you're going to the market with, B2B, B2C, you still need to understand how everything impacts the organization, the business, as well as how it impacts the user. And everyone can use the knowledge that we collect during our user research. So one of our guiding principles as we think about data projects, human first and process second. And here's what that looks like. So the participants are on the top of this slide on purpose, because we really want to start with who are we even talking about? Who are all the people that could possibly be involved in this product? And we always all know we have business stakeholders, but this one here sometimes is often overlooked if people come at it. An opposite problem is when you come at it from the user side, sometimes we don't talk to the data domain experts. People don't always do that. Our clients don't always do that. Business stakeholders will pull in UX people and they go off and create a project. So you kind of have the problem on both sides of the equation, but we want to make sure data domain experts are involved. Sometimes we call them SMEs, right? We have data scientists, product managers, designers, and developers. A lot of times data scientists are working with maybe data domain experts and developers in the background, and we don't get to talk to them. And then importantly, we have the data consumers. They may not be your business stakeholders or your SMEs or your domain experts, but they're the people who have to take action on the data. They have to find it and know what to do with it. So we like to think about, at a minimum, these buckets when we want to put together a new product and we think about having workshops. These are all the kinds of people that we want to have at the table contributing to the discussion. And then we go through our discovery phase and UX design phases. And these are just two phases, two swim lanes in a project. But we wanted to illustrate here today that, the discovery phase is a lot like any discovery phase you go through for a product project. But what we do at the forefront is the data domain workshop, where we're really bringing all of these different participants together and everyone is sharing their insights and knowledge. So we start from a baseline where, it's more open than it normally would be, and people have an opportunity to really learn and understand from experts what data exists and where that data is coming from, which is really important, how we access that data on the back end. And then we can start to have conversations about how the data relates and developing ontologies and taxonomies, and then thinking about the user experience and the user flows. And then we can get into our user experience design after we go from the workshop into requirements, and we analyze our data, metadata, do some rationalization, normalization. And I think it's really important too to document your current state. You want to know where you're coming from. So then as you design your experiences, you can kind of define that future state and say where you're going. But all of this, coupled with the user research and your technical review, lead into user experience design, which is where you can really get into how that data is going to show up for someone and how it's going to be meaningful for them, and what jobs to be done are involved in the UI. So this is what it looks like applied to a real project. You don't always get to do the right thing, right? And we all know that, and it can be really frustrating. We want to strive for all of this excellence, but it's okay sometimes if some of these things are left out. We don't always get access to data scientists. They might not exist, or they might be working on another project and coming into our project at a later time. And we all know that we skip this process a lot, user research or user testing, or we don't always go to high fidelity designs. But it's okay. I think the goal is just try and put the information in front of people who are sponsoring the project and talk about why these things matter and push for having representation and having a flow here. But I think even over the process, it's really important just to include the right people in the conversation. Data can't speak for itself, which is why that's another guiding principle that we have, and why it's important to include all of those people, because they can lend a voice to things like, how do we determine accuracy of the data? How do we govern the data? Or we don't have that data, right? Or it's old, or we have 10 different versions of that data. And then the users who are going to consume that data want to be able to say, what insights they want to get from that data, because showing people data sometimes just isn't enough. So for a data domain workshop, these are some of the outcomes that we achieve by going through these activities. And really, it's to me, this is one of the most important things that you can do. Along with user research, we don't always get to do user research, right? In a perfect world, we would. But if you can bring enough people to the table and have these conversations within your organization, you can then go deeper on understanding the domains and the subdomains and get to define those user needs and entities, behaviors, roles, ontologies. This really takes you through collecting all of the upfront information that you need to create the artifacts on the right-hand side of the screen here. And it helps you start your project from a place of shared understanding and alignment, especially if you can establish this common language. And we all know how difficult it is when you have a data scientist talking to a domain expert, in, let's say, the medical industry. Maybe they speak the same language, but oftentimes they don't. So there's a lot of learning. And if you start with this in mind, then you can kind of bring everybody along at the same time. And then I really like defining data context, because how I might want to use data could change depending on the context of where I'm viewing it and what I'm doing in my job. And this one really starts to shape that data story. And we all know the power of stories. And I think if you can create a story up front about your data project that you can use to talk to the entire organization and all of your stakeholders, it really helps people understand why the product is important, how you're using it, and where user experience fits in. So this is also important. When we think about the data, we often think the data is just back there doing its job. It's going to the UI, but we still, even in UX side, think about, where does the human fit in? How does the human interact with the data? Like, we have data and we know we're going to consume data on the front end, but sometimes we need to correct that data. Sometimes it's wrong, or sometimes we need to add to it, right? It needs to be additive. And this is, kind of blurry on purpose. This is something that we did for a client, but I wanted to illustrate that this was done by the UX team and product team as we talked about how we might interact with the system. And it wasn't done in a silo without talking to data scientists, right? We have had all the people at the table discussing how we might make sure that we have data accuracy and how we might include people in managing the data pipeline. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve for discussion on the Metadata Hub use case.
Yes, thank you, Karen. So I'd like to go through a use case from one of our clients that we have as a retailer, and they have a lot of employees. And one of the things they're focused on is training those employees. So they've got multiple learning content systems that are used by their employees. And then they also have content teams which manage the content in those learning systems as well too, within sort of the headquarters of the retailer. So the challenge here was that with these multiple systems and this group that's managing them, it became a challenge to manage the different courses within these systems, also to relate them to each other, to create pathways for learning, all became a really intensive effort. And so what became, for this retailer was that they had these silos of learning content management systems with data that wasn't interacting with each other. So they started to create Excel spreadsheets to relate them and put them together. And so that was the situation which they were in. And they decided that they were going to go ahead and look to figure out how they can take the information from these silos, take the information, the relationship information from the Excel spreadsheets and pull them together. And the first step that they came up with was a metadata hub. The next step is the knowledge graph. But first we'll focus on the metadata hub. So the first thing they did was they really looked at all the data within their silos and really tried to figure out exactly what data they needed and pull together. So what I want to go through in the next couple slides is the key learnings from this project, and then get into two specific areas of focus of this project. The first one being, how do you present the data from these different systems? And then the second one being, what about search? Search is a key component of any type of project like this. And how do you really tailor search in a way that's effective for the different groups? So why don't we go on to the next slide? So first and foremost from this project, once the client realized, okay, these are the systems that we want to pull together, and this is the metadata that we want to pull from these systems. It goes back to what Karen was talking earlier about being able to identify data and working with them and figure out exactly what data they want to pull and how they want to pull it together. Put it together, and then we pulled the information together in a metadata hub. And the first thing you find out is most likely that you don't have a lot of data, that these different systems collect data differently. And so if you're looking to pull them together in a knowledge graph, search and pulling these stuff together exposes the holes in your data very, very quickly. So the first big sort of roadblock in this project was to go back and actually fill in the data. And in this case, the team had to go back, the content management teams had to go back and figure that out. And this gets into number two. And this is where UX really starts to play in, is to fully understand the data within your source systems. So a lot of questions that need to happen that, different UX practitioners and UX research can really help with in figuring out what data is in these systems, where does it exist, how updated are those. For example, there was one field that the client was looking for and wanted to pull. And so we did a quick little research of that field and how it was filled in. It was filled in at 3%. So even though they thought this field was extraordinarily valuable in the actual data system, the data wasn't there. So you have to fully understand what data you have, what data you can potentially have, and what data is in those source systems. The next thing from a data perspective is source of truth. When we're creating a knowledge graph or a knowledge layer on top of different data systems, there has to be a source of truth. And you have to figure out if that source of truth is going to be the source system or the knowledge layer. It could be either. It depends upon the function of what you're trying to achieve. In this case, this client decided to make the source system the learning content management systems. And then the knowledge layer was simply pull data back and forth, basically push and pull. But this gets into a lot of things that happen with search, but also with the UX design and the UI design as well too. The other fourth key learning is data integrity. It is crucial. The long-term success of any data-driven project is going to be based on data integrity. So a large amount of effort and focus needs to make sure that the data pipelines that you set up, that the data interactions going back and forth, getting back to single source of truth, is all crucial to making sure that the right data is being pulled at the right time for the right interaction, for the right action of the user. UX is far more important in these processes than a lot of people realize, all the way down to finding what data there is, looking at the data, presenting that data to users, seeing if they have value in it, a whole series of steps that are taken from a UX perspective, and specifically from a UX research in the initial parts of these projects to really get at the value of the data, how it can be used, and how it can be used, and really getting at those data consumers and what they're looking for with it. Lastly, one of the crucial aspects of knowledge graphs is that they pull multiple sources of data. In doing that, you're pulling from multiple teams. and we'll get into this in a little bit when we talk a little bit more about the data, you have to align the teams, and they have to make sure they talk about in common language. They have to make sure that they understand what data is coming from what system. And what Karen talked about earlier is really, really important. And that is everybody understanding themselves? Do we have a common language of what we're talking about? Because we're building a new data layer with knowledge graphs and data hubs. And so we need to really make sure that everybody understands what everybody else is talking about. And aligning those and those expectations of those teams are very important to the success of the project. All right. So two key areas I want to pull out from, from this project. One is on the data and the presentation of the data. And this gets, data integrity. Users need to understand where the data is coming from, what the context of the data is. There needs to be a way within the application to understand what the source of this data is and what it is and how it's explained. And also the data's got to be consistent. In a knowledge graph presentation of data, you're probably going to have data that's going to be represented in different areas within the application. It has to be consistent. And then it has to be consistent within the source system as well, too. So there's a whole series of data integrity. If there's any disconnect between what a user expects to see on the data that's there versus the source system, you're going to lose that trust of the client and the user. And as soon as you lose the trust of the user in a data-driven product, you're most likely not going to come back. So we really get at, from our standpoint, from a predictive UX standpoint, we really look at ways we can use design. And Kyle will get into this in a minute as well, too. But design is a very powerful way to be able to relate the source. There are ways that you can quickly pull source onto a data presentation, onto a graph visual, onto a search result that really quickly allows you to say, oh, this is the source, or this is the context of it, this is where it's coming from, and this is what I can and can't do with this piece of data. And it becomes very, very crucial that you focus on the user interface of these when you present the design. And the design can really build trust just as much as data integrity, because if you're interacting with the data and it's being consistent and a whole series of other aspects of the data as you go through with it, if the design helps you, create the data you expect to create, you're building the trust with the user as well, too. And then lastly, don't underestimate the design, the data consumers in the design decisions. At the end of the day, the adoption of your data-driven product will come back to the data consumers, and they need to be aware of what's being presented and how they can use it. All right, next slide. We'll quickly talk about search. All right. So the other key takeaway from this project is search and the presentation of search. When you're building a data-driven product, search is going to be a key component, if not the most important component and function of the product. Being able to find information is critical to these knowledge graphs, data, and metadata hubs. And everybody likes to say, oh, make it Google-like. And that's great. That's really great if you're looking through billions and billions of pages and looking for specific pieces of information. But most knowledge graph implementations are not going to be doing that. They're also not really specific to the business user or the data consumer that's going to be using it. It's, a lot of, obviously, business applications are going to be built around a specific business workflow or business process in order to get the actionable intelligence out of that. That is not the same use case as Google. And so balancing those workflow needs of those users is crucial to the success of search. There's going to be different teams using a search functionality when you're talking about a knowledge graph that's combining multiple sources. So they're going to value the data differently. They're going to want to see different data. They're not going to want to see other data. And so there's a lot of conversations that need to happen within the different teams to make sure that you're presenting the right data and that you're presenting it in a way in which the pieces that are of most value to the most teams are presented. Now, you're not going to be able to present it all, but there's different ways that you can work through that. And a lot of it comes down to research, UX research, working with the users. In search, personas are crucial. You need to have multiple personas based on the different teams and how they're going to be using them, how they're going to be using search. And then user stories that come from them also have to drive, the relationships and the different information that's presented in search. There's a lot of testing that needs to go on for search. Because if you're pulling these different types of information, you want to make sure you have the right information. You want to get the results in front of the users to make sure that they can understand what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it, and that they're getting the information that's needed. And lastly, as you go through the UX process of designing a search for a knowledge graph, it's a lot of interviews that need to take place to understand how the application developed. With the knowledge graph, key function is search. With these types of interviews that you'll really get at the unmet needs of the user so that you can develop the search further, you can develop the data behind it, you can find the different data sources. And that's really where you're going to drive your product forward after it's an MVP, after it's pilot, whatever you want to continue to develop the product on. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kyle.
I wanted to add something here. Search is one of my
Sure.
favorite things. I love designing search user experiences, and a few things that come up when I've designed these in the past and things I like to look at when we do user research are understanding the current experience of a user. How are they going about finding this information today? How long does it take them? How many steps do they have to go through? And this really gets into the user journey and understanding, are they picking up the phone? Are they sending emails? Are they hunting and pecking and storing things on their own in their own spreadsheet? But then beyond that, I really like to look at what action they need to take on that and making search results as actionable as possible. I'm a big fan of, if I see it in search, I want to act on it immediately. I don't even want to have to click on it if I don't have to. So making search highly actionable. And then Steve mentioned that you have all of this data coming from disparate sources, and all of it has different types of metadata, and there are going to be gaps in the metadata. But beyond that, also the language barrier. If I'm sitting in a specific discipline within an organization and we have a way of talking about the work that we're doing that's unique to us, that's different from somebody else in a different discipline in the organization, suddenly you have to think about how your search facets work for that user experience. If I don't think the way that you've described the facets, then I'm going to have a hard time narrowing the scope of results and finding exactly what I need in that moment. So I think that's really critical when you're thinking about data, and bringing it to the forefront of the user in the search experience is really focusing on that taxonomy and the terminology and what metadata is important to surface in search so that it's valuable for those unique personas Steve mentioned. Hopefully I didn't take things that Kyle was going to say.
Yeah, I'm done. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so along those same lines, I would say that the two experiences I tend to design for are either search or explore. And search is where you're kind of sure of what you're looking for. You have something at least specific in mind. And explore is where you're not sure what you're looking for. This could be a gift for someone in your family, could be a vacation spot. And in this case, the client that we've been working with has an explore experience that they did not design. And the reason that happens is because people, when they're searching for results, can't find them. So you put people out to explore, unfortunately, without their consent, which is not where you want to be, especially if you're building a search tool. So one of the things and challenges that we're approaching or approached initially is that folks are using a spreadsheet. And spreadsheets can be unwieldy, they're difficult to load, they have issues with roles and permissions. So you can't send part of a spreadsheet to someone, you have to break it out, which then fractures the collaboration of that spreadsheet and creates a lot of opportunities to drop things through the cracks. And another challenge that we had is creating a modern and modular design architecture that's responsive to the different user jobs to be done, keeping those roles and permissions in mind, because not all users should be able to delete content. And not all of them should be able to alter it in a way that then affects, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of other users. And then, of course, you also need to create some sort of user interface that is readable and usable for people. And you're not showing them things they don't need. You're showing them what they need, when they need it, where they need it. So some of the solutions we went through is trying to really deeply empathize and respect the user's current workflow. Because most of the time when you speak with the user, they'll say, oh, we use a bunch of spreadsheets, but there's probably some sort of gold in their current process that you can replicate. And no matter how good what you design is, at some point they'll say, well, I can do that in my spreadsheet, or someone will have a bad day and will look back to their spreadsheet and say, I miss when I could do X, Y, Z. And that's an opportunity for you to identify those things that they really value and make them even better in a new experience or a new application or a new knowledge graph or database interaction tool, whatever you would like to call it, that you're working with. Another thing that we've been working on, you won't see these in the screenshots, but I can briefly talk through them, is trying to get our data in service of where and when we need it into something that's callable or retrievable throughout the the platform that we're working on. In one case, we had, I think, maybe 3 or 4 dozen fields put into the same component, and calling a specific field or just being able to reuse that and surface that to the user when they needed it was not an easy task. So we split that up into different ways and microservices, and basically a user interface that allows us to pull in pieces or even sections of things without having to create custom queries and then lower the integrity of our data, which is really not something that we'd like to do. We also try to design with the lowest level of permissions. That means that we design first for the most restrictive environment, and then we open it up once we get to know people. So it's a trust but verify mechanism when we're building this. And we also want to work with the lowest common denominator of data complexity and then expand from there. And what I mean by that is we want to give people exactly what they need, especially in a search result, right up front. That way they don't have to dig further. They're not set on an explore mission to Mars with a limited amount of oxygen. They can look through the results, find something that they need, and make an informed decision about their next step. And then finally, one of the big things, or one of my, I guess, pet peeves, is when you try to do things that are fancy that end up confusing people. If you're working on a workflow tool that accelerates subject matter experts and makes a difference to a business's bottom lines, just use patterns and components that are familiar to the user. Don't frustrate them. Let them do their job. Hopefully help them do it quicker. And when possible, try to do things that are comfortable and familiar to them, and be kind to them, instead of, perhaps introducing something that looks great but is not quite as functional for that user's day-to-day job. And that's my portion here, I guess, and I'll pass it back to you, Steve, to wrap us up. Or maybe I'll pass it to Jen.
I think we can pass it directly to Jen.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'll be talking about a client project we recently had. And this client's challenge was to really help the physician during a patient visit. So you can advance over to the next slide. Thank you. So in short, during a patient visit, the actual visit lasts, maybe 15 minutes. And this results in physicians sometimes getting diagnoses wrong, especially if it's something they're just not used to seeing. So the challenge with this existing product is that it has to work with an existing EHR. So the product is supposed to lay over the actual electronic health record. So, and this is supposed to help to provide decision support. So it's not supposed to replace or replicate the actual EHR, but there will be shared data, related to vitals, lab results, and symptoms. And I'll go into the key takeaways around the data and design. So it took us a while to get to, the actual final results. Well, a while I say, but it's really only 6 weeks. And we did this over the course of 4 different studies. We really tried to study the design decisions that we made and really understand who the users were in order to advance to the next sprint. Right. Great. So some of the key takeaways, I'll go through them right now. As Karen mentioned before, we don't always get to do research. So any form of user research is always valuable. It can take multiple formats, and not every company is really willing to spend the extra time and money to gather research. Or maybe at some point they did in the beginning, but they haven't updated the research in a while, so it can quickly become outdated. So this is why any form of user research, take what you can, but obviously continue really vocalizing the need for further research, or at least consistent research, especially as market conditions change, and so do users' expectations. So next, a baseline usability test is really helpful to know the starting point and to really know what you're testing improvements against. This also allows us to understand the user's current state and know what actually works well and what they're used to. Data can be niche specific, and what we've realized is that, as much as we can learn and we can adapt to industries, the domain experts ultimately know their context the best. We would have never been able to learn all of the medical jargon and related context during the multiple week project. So we did what we could. We learned the most important terms for the product, and we let the users guide us the rest of the way. And it's also one of the reasons why we tested so often, to make sure that the understanding wasn't getting compromised as we added each design update. Right, providing definitions. This is also really important and helps to increase users' trust.
So we would take away data that seemed unnecessary because most of our users really understood what the actual terms were. So we would provide definitions through tooltips or allowing them to go to the direct source of the data from the EMR itself. Right. And control. So this relates to trust, because if you can't interact with a system, then essentially it's just a report. And being able to manipulate the data really helped the users feel a sense of trust, because they saw things moving and updating and, you know, providing results that they expected or didn't expect, but at least they saw things moving. All right, and then time to information is a critical factor in most cases, but especially in this particular case, because the time that the physician has with the patient is really limited, and they have a lot of other things to go through, so we don't want to get in the way. All right, now key takeaways specifically to design is considering how a product can interact with other products. In this case, our users spend most of the day in a standard light theme enterprise UI system. So Karen, if you can go to the next slide really quick, just to show. And yeah, so this is kind of their day in and day out, really used to seeing this very light theme, a lot of data. And so if you can go back to the previous one, Karen. So we had to really consider how this product would work with multiple different types of EHRs. And we realized that we can adjust the colors as much as we want, but ultimately they needed something really higher contrast. So this is why we suggested the dark theme. Too many icons may make an app feel less serious. During testing, at one point, someone had mentioned that we had several icons that it's starting to feel really cutesy or less serious. So we did take away some of the icons and we opted for words, because this actually really affects trust, right? How serious someone is taking your data will affect how you are trusting in what you're seeing. Red and green are not always the only ways to show good and bad. So over here on the right, there's an image with like a deuteranopia layer on top of the design. And it shows that what we really want to make sure the user is getting out of this is that they're seeing the contrast between the shades and the colors themselves. And we're doing this through orange and greens, but not your typical red and green traffic light, because it also affects people who are colorblind. And then finally here, enterprise systems are usually more data heavy than consumer apps. It's really for a targeted group of people. So it's okay to get deep and rich. Clinicians in particular like to see as much data as possible. So they don't care as much about white space and visual balance as folks do for consumer apps. Everyone deserves a good experience, but it's also subjective. Right. So yeah, if you go back to the previous one again, this is an example of the light theme. So it's hidden. You can probably hardly see it. It's over on the right. And it's really competing with the EHR in the background. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that this is a dark theme. It does really contrast against the EMR in the background. But we still think it's important to offer a light theme in case the EMR is actually set to the dark theme, since it is an accessibility affordance as well. Right. So we did, as mentioned, 4 usability testing sessions, and during each testing session, we used both the NASA TLX and the System Usability Survey to help us get to a more quantitative side of usability testing. So the NASA TLX is typically used in human factors research. It was developed by the Human Performance Group at NASA and used in a variety of domains like aviation, healthcare, and essentially whenever it involves tasks involving human interaction with the machine. So it's really highly specialized tasks. And the purpose is to evaluate mental workload demand on an individual performing a specific task. So after a user completes a set of tasks in a section, it was followed by a questionnaire. We had many questions in our tests, so it was going to get really overwhelming to give a post-task survey after every single question. So we grouped it into sections. And this allowed us to determine the mental workload per section. There is complex scoring related to NASA TLX. There's an app developed by NASA to help with this, so that definitely helped us, as well as some calculators online. But they've tested this this survey quite a lot, and so we trust them. All right, and then the system usability survey is a really standard way of testing usability and ease of use. So we did the system usability survey as a post-test survey, and we collected both of the scoring. And it was really cool to see how it improved week after week. It was almost like instant gratification, just watching it improve. All right, and then finally, this is a little peek at the design system, which allowed us to iterate and deliver in around 6 weeks. And we designed this in Figma, so it really allowed us to move much faster. All right, I hope I made the right time.
Yeah, that was great. And I wanted to add that the slides that we're showing with the design system and the app, we just replaced it with Latin, but in our testing, we actually used real data. And I think it's important to use real data. Any application you're developing, the more real and accurate the data can be, the better your test results. Then you're really talking to users in the context of how they would actually use the application. They can see what results they might get and how they might interact with data, which can help drive adoption. And it also helps create champions, within the organization. If it's an internal enterprise application and people within the organization are kind of on the team to test it, then they can help advocate for the usability and value of the data system. So with that, our next Meetup topic is going to be on governance. So we're going to look at what the roles are, in governing data, who does what, how do you know who should be doing what, and how do you put governance together? So we have about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to give us a chance to go over any Q&A. And the floor is open if anyone wants to ask a question. I'll check the chat window here too as well. And yes, we'll show the recording. So feel free to speak up if anyone has a question. If not, we can certainly wrap up a little bit early.
Hi, Karen. I think I'll ask you a question around the earlier. One of your earlier slides talked about the different roles that people would play in the entire system, and then I noticed that you mentioned the executives, right? And I kind of want to get your sense, the business stakeholders rather. I kind of want to get your experience with that. Like, how do you convince someone as a business stakeholder that doing all of this work on the UX and using systems like Knowledge Graph would actually improve their life or their job?
Yeah, so the user experience conversation is something I can speak to, and I think Steve can speak to the knowledge graph question better than I can. The way that we work with clients, we're not internal to the organization, so there's already buy-in that exists. Like, we're going to be doing this project, we want UX involved, so we're there. So usually my role involves talking about how can we make sure we actually get to do all of the things in the user experience lifecycle. But we also conduct the workshops often. So we're at the forefront saying, let's plan these workshops, let's talk about who needs to be present, and we tell the value story. I think one of the things that is most challenging anytime you talk about something like user experience and even development sometimes is people see it as a highly commoditized thing and anyone can do it, or it's gotten like it's become sort of low value in some ways. And so I think the conversation needs to be about telling that value story. And as I mentioned before, if you can...
How hot my field is right now. I literally have 15,000
if you can explain where user experience research touches the process and show that, I think, visually and tell the story, then you have better buy-in. Now, buy-in doesn't always mean that we would get to do the work, right? So we're very open and flexible about including people from any enterprise organization we're working with and saying, if you have people who are user researchers, or you have people who are able to document current state, or you've already done some of this work, we invite everybody to the table and try and remain open and highly collaborative. We also approach it from a learning perspective, where we do a lot of primers up front and we describe all the things that we're talking about, because we're coming to the table with a lot of jargon too. In some cases, business stakeholders don't know the value that's on the other side of some of the work that we're doing. So if we can explain the terminology, show them past performance and use cases, and then that usually helps. But we don't always get the win at the end of the day there either. So it's certainly a problem we're familiar with. Steve?
Yeah, so from a knowledge graph perspective, 3 or 4 years ago, I went to some business stakeholders with a different knowledge graph idea, and it was very data focused. It was very data centric. It was, I'm going to take these sources, I'm going to pull it together. And they agreed with it. They said, this is a good idea and good way to test and all of that. And the challenge there was that as I went ahead and built this project and got the buy-in from a data perspective, I neglected the UX perspective. And I realized then, 3 or 4 years ago, that it's actually more important from a business stakeholder standpoint to get them to understand what the end result and the value will be, and to push that UX understanding and research all the way to the forefront, and not so much worry about the knowledge graphs they understand underneath it. From a data perspective, I understood that I needed the disparate data sources, and I was going to leverage, a knowledge graph, a graph database, put a taxonomy ontology on top of it, and I'm going to build that recommendation engine. But, from a business stakeholder, they wanted to see what was the focus on the recommendation engine, right? Was the knowledge and the intelligence that was going to be gained out of this what they were, expecting based on the amount of investment they were going to give. And so it really changed my perspective. And so now when I'm approaching business stakeholders, I approach them more from, that UX, that research standpoint of getting at the data consumers, understanding exactly what they need, exactly sort of their unmet needs, and then, developing those initial screens and ideas with the understanding of the architecture behind it, is most likely going to be built in knowledge graph. So that's really what I focus. That's really what I want to try to focus when I talk now to business stakeholders. Is it's not about the knowledge graph. It's not about breaking down the silos. They all love that idea and think it's good, but that doesn't get to the end business value of what they're looking for. And that's really where the focus needs to be. And you can really help, building some of those UX processes into those types of conversations to really push the everything forward, and also set the proper expectations about what the data can do, how it's going to affect your business, and what business outcomes are going to come from that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Steve and Karen.
You're welcome. Yes, I'll post to the, I'll send out a message to the group with the recording after the meetup. So we are almost out of time, but I think Steve, brought that home kind of nicely, that we're trying to move away from user experience research is all about focusing on the problems we have to solve. And then I think the technology we use to solve that problems, shouldn't come first, right? We want to really understand what we need to do. And then I think when we look at technology solutions, I mean, I've done an impact analysis before, and I've looked at, comparisons in terms of what technology solution makes the most sense. And I think you have to, in those cases, like to Steve's point, it might not always be a knowledge graph, right? We want to look at what data exists and what solutions exist today within the enterprise. And there's always the buy versus build conversation. And you want to look at, what your priorities are in terms of features that are needed. What can you solve with what you have today? And we use those pieces of information to create a roadmap and create some alignment around, architecture decisions and where we want to take things from a technical perspective. But I think always coming at it with the solution up front is how we all get into trouble on any data or, project where there's a UI involved and we're investing money. We want to really look at the user needs first. So we have a few more chats here. We do work with junior researchers sometimes, just at various points in time. And actually, we've had quite a few here, and we've done a lot of mentoring within the organization, both on the data knowledge graph side as well as on the user experience side. Yes, and Jen said, but we're not hiring currently. That's true. Thanks, Jen. Okay, so I think we're at time. Thank you everyone for attending. As I said, I will send out a message through the Meetup to give you guys access to the recording, and you're welcome. And we appreciate you being here. Look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.